Just when it felt like things might be settling down a little, we now have governors across the country calling on the president to issue 1,700 refund payments to millions of Americans. And the timing of this could not be more significant. This comes just days after the Supreme Court struck down the tariffs, which sent a wave of confusion and concern through communities already anxiously watching the fate of those $2,000 dividend payments the president has been discussing since late last year. And now, almost immediately after that ruling, we have state governors stepping forward and saying to the administration, you owe the American people their money back. This is a major development, and I want to walk you through exactly what is happening, who is behind it, what the numbers look like, and what it realistically could mean for you. Let me pull up this article because I think seeing the details laid out clearly is really important here. There is a lot of noise and confusion swirling around all of this right now, and I want to make sure that what you are getting from this video is the straight, honest picture without the drama layered on top of it. So let's talk about what is actually in this story and why it matters. The two governors who have come out publicly calling for these $1,700 refund payments are California Governor Gavin Newsom and the governor of Illinois. Both have issued statements directed at the administration, arguing that American households have effectively been overcharged as a result of the tariff policies that were in place from early 2025 through January of 2026. The number they are using is striking. According to their argument, the average American household paid an additional $1,251 above normal costs during that period, specifically because of the tariffs that were implemented. That is the figure they are basing the $1,700 refund request on. It is essentially them saying the tariffs functioned as an indirect tax on American families. The Supreme Court has now ruled those tariffs illegal, and therefore those families deserve their money back. The Illinois governor took it a step further in a way that I honestly found pretty notable. Rather than just issuing a public statement or making remarks at a press conference, the governor's office actually sent what they framed as an invoice to the administration explicitly labeled as delinquent and past due for the total amount owed to Illinois residents based on that $1,700 per household calculation. Now, whatever you think about the politics of that move, it is a genuinely aggressive and unusual step. Governors do not typically send invoices to the federal government. The fact that this one did tells you something about how seriously at least some state leaders are taking this issue and how much pressure they intend to apply. Now, here is what I think is really important to understand about where this goes from here. Do I think California and Illinois are going to be the only two governors making this kind of argument? Not for a second. Once a few prominent voices establish this framing, which is that the tariffs were illegal, they cost households real money, and the people deserve to be made whole, other governors are going to start echoing it, particularly governors in states where household budgets have been under serious strain from inflation and elevated prices over the past couple of years. This is a politically powerful argument in both red and blue states because it is not ideological, it is transactional. You took extra money from my constituents through a mechanism the Supreme Court says was illegal. Give it back. That message is going to resonate across a pretty wide spectrum of voters and politicians, regardless of party. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about the bigger picture. The president genuinely needs a significant win right now. I said this in my video yesterday, and I want to say it again here because I think it is the most important political context for understanding where all of this might land. The Supreme Court delivered a high-profile defeat on one of his signature economic policies. The tariff agenda was central to how this administration presented its economic vision. Having that struck down publicly is a meaningful setback in a midterm election year. In that environment, the incentive to respond with something equally visible and meaningful for ordinary Americans is extremely high, or whether that is the original $2,000 dividend payment, a modified version of it, or some form of a tariff refund check like what these governors are now calling for. The political pressure to put money in people's hands before November is real, and it is building. Now, I also want to address something that came up in that article and that I know is creating a lot of confusion right now, which is the question of whether the tariff revenues that the government already collected are going to be refunded to the businesses and corporations that paid them. Because a lot of people are conflating two very different things here. There is the question of whether large businesses and importers are going to get their tariff payments back. And there's the question of whether ordinary American households might receive some kind of refund or payment for the higher costs they absorbed as consumers. Those are completely separate conversations with completely different dynamics, and I think it is really important not to mix them up. On the business side, the question of whether companies that paid tariffs on imported goods are going to see those payments returned is genuinely unresolved and almost certainly heading toward years of litigation. The president indicated directly on Friday that he does not expect that money to be paid back to businesses anytime soon, if ever, and that any court process around it could drag on for years. I tend to agree with that assessment. The logistical complexity of refunding hundreds of billions of dollars across thousands of businesses of all sizes would be staggering, and the administration has been clear that they do not intend to initiate that process voluntarily. So for the businesses, I would not be counting on any refund in any meaningful near-term time frame. But for ordinary Americans, for households that absorbed higher prices as consumers of goods and services throughout the period when those tariffs were in effect, the conversation looks meaningfully different, because what these governors are proposing is not a business refund. It is a people refund. It is an acknowledgement that the cost of those tariffs did not stay at the port or in the warehouse. It flowed through the supply chain and landed in the grocery cart, in the appliance store, in the auto dealership, in every place where American families spend their money. The $1,751 average household figure that these governors are citing is their calculation of how much of that tariff burden was ultimately borne by consumers rather than absorbed by businesses. And the argument they are making is that if the tariffs were illegal, and the Supreme Court says they were, then the money those tariffs effectively extracted from household budgets should come back. I also want to spend a moment on something that I know a lot of people are hoping for, but that I think requires an honest reality check, which is the idea that with the tariffs now struck down, prices on everyday goods are going to start dropping noticeably. I genuinely wish I could tell you that is what is coming, because I know how much financial pressure households have been under. But that is just not how pricing works in the real economy, and I would be doing you a disservice if I let that expectation go unchallenged. Every retailer, every wholesaler, every importer in the supply chain that was affected by those tariffs paid higher prices to get their inventory onto shelves and into warehouses. They passed those costs forward to consumers because that is what businesses do when their input costs rise. The tariffs being struck down now does not change what those businesses already paid for their existing inventory. They are not going to eat those costs and drop their prices just because the legal environment changed. The economics simply do not work that way. What is more realistic, and even this is going to take time to show up, is that new inventory ordered and imported after the tariff removal may eventually come in at lower cost, and that lower cost might gradually work its way into pricing over a period of several months. We are talking about a 4 to 6 month lag at minimum before any meaningful price relief could show up even in the most optimistic scenario. And that is assuming the alternative tariff mechanisms the administration is already implementing do not simply replace the cost pressure that was removed by the Supreme Court's ruling. Which brings me to the next thing I want to address directly. Because the president has not stepped back from tariffs as a policy tool, he has stepped around the specific legal mechanism that the Supreme Court found invalid and immediately found another path forward. Within hours of the ruling, he signed an executive order implementing a 10% global tariff on all countries. That is already in effect. And beyond that, the administration has identified at least 2 additional mechanisms through which further tariff revenues can be generated. These are levers that can be pulled relatively quickly, and the administration has signaled clearly that they intend to use them. So the idea that the tariff era is over and that we are moving into a period of significantly lower import costs and consumer price relief, That is not the trajectory we are actually on. The tariff revenue may slow temporarily during the transition between the old mechanisms and the new ones, but the direction of policy is toward maintaining and potentially expanding that revenue stream, not abandoning it. The president has actually expressed confidence that these new approaches could bring in more money than the IEEPA tariffs that were struck down. Whether that turns out to be accurate remains to be seen, but it is significant that his posture coming out of this Supreme Court ruling is not retreat. It is escalation through alternative means. And if those new mechanisms do end up generating comparable or greater revenue, then the financial picture for some kind of large-scale payment to American households, whether that is the $2,000 dividend, a modified version of it, or a tariff refund framework along the lines of what these governors are now proposing, remains very much alive. Let me also be honest about something that does not always get discussed openly when we talk about these kinds of direct payments, which is the inflationary effect. If the government were to issue $1,700 or $2,000 checks to millions of American households, that would inject hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy in a very short period of time. What happens when a large amount of new money chases the same amount of available goods and services? Prices go up. That is basic supply and demand, and it is not a political argument. It is just economics. So while a $1,700 or $2,000 payment would be genuinely helpful and meaningful for a lot of families right now, and I include myself in that, we should go in with clear eyes about the fact that a significant injection of consumer spending money into an already somewhat elevated inflationary environment is going to put upward pressure on prices. The relief you feel from the payment could be partially offset by what happens to prices in the months that follow. That does not mean the payment would be a bad thing. For most families, the immediate benefit of having that money in hand would outweigh the longer-term diffuse effect of modestly higher prices. But it is worth understanding the full picture so you can make smart decisions about how you use those funds if they do arrive. So, where does all of this leave us right now in terms of the realistic outlook? Here is how I see it. The governors coming out with this $1,700 refund demand are establishing a political narrative that the administration is going to have to respond to in some form. More governors are likely to follow. The pressure to do something visible and meaningful for American households is intensifying rather than easing in the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling. The administration has already demonstrated through the rapid executive order implementing a 10% global tariff that it is not going to sit still and absorb a defeat. It is going to fight back through every available channel. And the midterm election calendar creates a very real deadline for delivering something that voters can point to as a tangible win for their financial situation. The $2,000 original dividend proposal, the $1,700 tariff refund that these governors are now demanding, and whatever the administration comes up with as its own response to this political moment, these are all different forms of the same underlying pressure point. American families have been squeezed financially. The tariff policies that contributed to that squeeze have now been ruled illegal, and there is enormous political energy from multiple directions simultaneously pushing towards some kind of payment to the people. What form that ultimately takes, what the exact amount is, what the eligibility criteria look like, and when it actually arrives, all of that is still genuinely uncertain. But the direction of the pressure is clear, and it is real. I am going to keep watching this closely and bring you every significant development as it happens. This situation is moving fast, and the next few weeks are going to be very revealing about how the administration responds to the combined pressure of the Supreme Court ruling and now these gubernatorial demands for household refunds. Drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Tell me what you are hearing, what you are worried about, and what you want me to dig into next. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and I will catch you in the next one.